Hello, my name is Scott Neigh, and today on Talking Radical's Book Talk project, I'm going to be talking about Mirrors, Stories of Almost Everyone by Eduardo Galeano. Earlier this year, I came to the rather startling realization that relatively little of what I read bears much resemblance to the kinds of things that I want to be writing. I want to be writing things that are thoughtful, that are social in terms of their approach, that are radical in terms of being to the root, and that are writerly in terms of their approach to craft. But what I mostly read online is journalistic, or polemical, or analytical without being particularly thoughtful or writerly. And most of the nonfiction that I read offline tends to be too scholarly or too plain or just not enough of those four characteristics that I really want to be cultivating in my own work. Now, that doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with the things that I read. It doesn't mean that I'm planning on not reading some big chunk of that material, but it does mean that I've come to the conclusion that it is a bit counterproductive for me to be so focused as I make decisions about what to read on the content of that material, instead of paying at least some attention to ways in which the writing, the craft, the form, whatever, can challenge and inspire me as I do my own work. So as I thought about how I wanted to sort of shift my approach in doing that, one of the things that I did is I put together a list of writers whose work I either knew or suspected would fit those characteristics that I just described. One of the names that ended up on that list was Eduardo Galeano, and the book of his, at least the first book of his, that I somewhat arbitrarily decided to read with that in mind was this one, Mirrors. Now, Mirrors is a history of the world, though it's a history of a very particular sort. It definitely is from below and to the left, to borrow a slogan from the Zapatistas, but it doesn't look anything like what you would see from, for example, an academic left historian who would be writing for their discipline, nor is it much like what you would usually see from people doing historical writing in more grassroots contexts, whether that's people who are autodidacts or people who are deprofessionalized academics. It certainly draws on a lot of that kind of source. Lots of conventional and scholarly historical sources have clearly been used by Galeano in figuring out what he wanted to write here. But what he has produced does not attempt to become another one of that kind of source. You might draw the distinction by talking about accessibility, because it's a very accessibly written book, but I don't think that quite captures it, because often when we describe writing as accessible, I think often that carries with it an impression of being kind of boring, kind of plain, and that certainly is not the case here, where the writing is very much focused on being engaging and clever and mischievous even and entertaining. So the almost 400 pages of this book are packed full of very brief, carefully crafted stories. The stories are almost universally shorter than a page. The material begins from myths that are drawn from the ancient world, and it works its way up to the present, or very close to the present. It draws on material from all over the world, and it centers the overlooked, the downtrodden, and the forgotten. In terms of the form that these small stories take, it varies a lot. A moment, a tangent, a scattering of points from a life, a particularly compelling conjunction of facts, a poetic vignette. But one thing that is shared by all of them is that they don't read like written history. They come across more like stories told aloud. And certainly they're written with a master storyteller's sensibility, both in terms of rhythm, for which I'm sure we can at least partially thank translator Mark Freed, as well as Galeano's original writing, and in terms of detail, because the little stories are put together in a way that uses carefully selected details to convey a feeling or an essence or an impression rather than any effort to exhaustively describe anything. Now, I'm sure you could quibble. I'm sure you could point to particular details, particular anecdotes, particular ways of trying to convey the essence of some historical moment or figure or event and argue that it isn't sufficiently nuanced, that it doesn't choose the right detail, that it is somehow not quite the right impression. And I'm sure you could also look at the selection of the stories and critique that as well, because the book very much does push back against Eurocentrism, and it pushes back against patriarchy, among other things, but perhaps it could do better, perhaps it could do more. But even given the possibility for critique, it's a delightful read, and the voice of the writing and the politics are really clear and really strong, as you would expect from a master of Galeano's caliber at the later stages of his career. Perhaps the only downside is that there are parts of it that are just heartbreaking rather than being inspiring. But, I mean, I think that's really more about the history of our world than it is about the writing. Now, in terms of the question of whether or not this is the kind of writing that I want to be doing, I'm not sure that that actually is the right question to be asking, at least not in that way. I'm not going out there and looking for forms that I want to mimic. What I'm looking for is writing that meets that cluster of characteristics within the range kind of described by that cluster of characteristics that I talked about at the beginning, that I can be challenged by and inspired by. And this certainly is that. It's thoughtful, it's social, it's radical, and it's writerly, and it's very much the kind of thing that I want to be reading more of as I plod forward on my own work. And I hope that if anything that I've said here is of interest to you, that perhaps it's the sort of thing that you might be interested in reading as well. Thank you very much for listening. Please check out the link below to the written version of this review and all of the various links I've included to my social media presences. I particularly encourage you to check out Talking Radical Radio, my weekly radio show that is organized around in-depth interviews with activists from across Canada. And for now, that is goodbye. Thank you very much for listening, and I will be back soon with another installment of Talking Radical's Book Talk Project.